Welcome to the ICRIER podcast. WTO Ministerial has just concluded in Cameroon. ICRIER has just come out with a policy brief on this meeting. I have with me today the two lead authors of this policy brief, Dr. Shekhar Aiyar, who is director of ICRIER, and Mr. Rajesh Aggarwal, who's joining us from Geneva and is visiting professor at ICRIER. Welcome to the show to both of you.
Thank you, Puja.
Dr. Aiyar, this meeting in Cameroon assembled at a time when the WTO is seen to be increasingly losing relevance, and its guiding principles, a level playing field, the most favored nation principle, and a technocratic way of resolving trade disputes is seen to be increasingly at odds with the current policies I cased. What has the meeting contributed towards reviving the WTO's relevance?
Very little is the short and simple answer. And in fact, that explains the title of our policy brief, which is A Difficult Ministerial. The three issues that you touched on, I think, are exactly the right ones, and they lie at the heart of the debate about multilateralism. So let's take them one by one. So let's start with the most favored nation principle. So for people who may not be familiar with it, that simply means that a concession which is extended to one member must be extended to all. So that is like a grounding principle of the WTO. If Australia lowers its tariffs on French wine, it must equally lower the tariff on Chilean wine, Indian wine, and the wine of every other WTO member. This simple but radical idea is what was responsible for many countries deciding to participate in the WTO, to take advantage of this, and also for the huge lowering of tariffs that has taken place since the end of the Second World War to today. Unfortunately, that process has kind of ground to a halt. There's been very little action on the multilateral front in recent years. And as we all know, the world's economic superpower has come out with sweeping tariffs on almost every other nation in the world, which openly violate WTO principles. The second thing you mentioned was a level playing field. And one of the chief irritants in this process right now is industrial subsidies. So after China acceded to the WTO in 2001, many people have accused China of using state-owned enterprises, and not just fiscal, but also banking system and monetary and exchange rate subsidies to unfairly advantage its own companies. There's a recent IMF paper which calculates that the fiscal support by itself could be as large as 4% per annum, 4% of GDP. And other countries have started following suit. So in America, you had the CHIPS Act, you had the Inflation Reduction Act, Europe has got its own programs, India has PLI schemes to incentivize certain things. And I like the Paul Krugman analogy of a baseball game. If you have one row in the baseball game stand up to get a better view, that's fine. But the problem is that when the people in front of them also stand up, and then the people in front of them also stand up, and so on and so forth, at the end of the day, you've got everybody standing with exactly the same view of the baseball. And this is the problem with this kind of competitive subsidies, and it is a problem which doesn't look to be solved. The third thing you mentioned was a technocratic way of resolving trade disputes. So there is like a court which is at the apex of the WTO, which hears trade disputes. And in about 2017, the first Trump administration stopped appointing judges to it. It doesn't have a quorum now, so it cannot function, it cannot resolve disputes. And so the dispute resolution function of the WTO has also fallen away. On each of these three major questions for multilateralism, the MFN principle, the level playing field, and trade dispute resolution, there was no progress at this ministerial. So in answer to your question, no.
Mr. Aggarwal, what is the overall fallout of the ministerial's proceedings on India's strategic and economic interests?
Yeah. See, WTO's 14th ministerial meeting, to my mind, it marked a structural shift in how global trade rules are being made. The WTO is becoming a platform where coalitions of the willing are setting the rules. Now, let's be clear. Not every WTO member is on board with this shift. And the clearest example is the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement. Out of 129 members who negotiated and backed this plurilateral deal, one country and only one blocked its incorporation into the WTO legal framework, and that country is our own, India. Now, it's important to set the record straight. India was one of the 36 members that did not participate in negotiating the agreement. But here's the difference. The other 35 non-participants didn't stand in the way. They didn't object to the agreement being added to the WTO rulebook. And mind you, this includes United States. They didn't object, especially since including so wouldn't impose any obligations on them. Now, India took a different path. It exercised its veto to stop the agreement from entering the WTO's legal architecture. So, what happened next is actually pretty simple. Instead of getting stuck behind the usual naysayers, the kind of coalition of the willing just moved. They decided they weren't going to sit around waiting for everyone to agree. Now, what is this step? It's important to understand that. Look at this e-commerce initiative, which is similar to the Investment Facilitation for Development Plurilateral Initiative. There's 66 WTO members. They just committed to implement the agreement amongst themselves without waiting for the entire membership to sign off. Now we understand that the members of the investment agreement will also do the same. Now, what this really signals is something big. Rule making at WTO is no longer going to freeze every time one country hits the brakes. Now, what is the business implication of this step? When a critical mass of WTO members moves ahead with plurilateral agreements, especially of the regulatory nature, the standards they create don't stay confined to that group. Over time, they become de facto global benchmarks. They will shape how value chains operate, how regulations evolve, and how investment decisions are made. Look at the deeper consequence of this shift, which is even more striking. When a major economy like India chooses to stand apart from a proposal backed by such a broad majority of countries, inevitably raises questions. It can make India look hesitant about transparency, hesitant about modern rulemaking, and hesitant about the very reforms global economy is moving toward. And that perception clashes with what we want to do at home. We want to be a reform economy. We want to move ahead. And we have spent such efforts in enhancing our business environment in the last decade. I mean, that's the point. Staying outside these frameworks doesn't really mean escaping their impact. It actually, the impact could be very negative due to perceptual damage that it causes. And that's where India has to face a choice. At the end of the day, India needs a strategy that's as bold as its ambitions, one that safeguards its core interests without stepping away from global rule-making table, which will shape not only the future of international trade, but our own path towards Viksit Bharat.
In fact, in the run-up to the meeting, the moratorium on e-commerce was talked about a great deal. What happened with that?
Right. See, for 27 years since 1998, WTO had a simple temporary understanding: no customs duties on electronic transmissions. Every 2 years, members would renew it. But over time, the issue got hotter. Developed countries, especially the United States, wanted to make the moratorium permanent. Several developing countries pushed back, worried about losing tariff revenue and limiting their digital policy space. Now, this year, negotiators were close, and I would say really close to agreeing on a 4-year extension all the way to the end of 2030. For the first time ever, the renewal collapsed. It collapsed because Brazil and Turkey didn't join the consensus. Now, here, India's story gets interesting. Since 1998, India has always complained about the moratorium: lost revenue, shrinking policy space, and all that. What it has never actually done is to block it. And this time, too, India wasn't the one that stopped the extension. But India's position today should be very different from that of a typical developing country. India is a heavyweight in digital trade, According to NASSCOM, India commands about 35% of the global IT services market, is the fourth largest exporter of digitally delivered services, and exported $257 billion worth of such services in 2023, more than all the other low and middle income countries combined. So India has a real stake in keeping digital trade open and predictable. And that's why many, even within India, argue that it should take a more forward leaning role in these negotiations. I would say it's not the end of the story. Members are already gearing up to revisit the issue urgently at WTO headquarters in Geneva, and there is a strong push to bring the moratorium back through consensus. And we all hope that it will happen.
Agriculture was also on the agenda. What happened with agriculture?
Agriculture is a very big issue in India, as we know. And India has been pushing hard at the WTO, and it is actually pushing for public stockholding for food security. Back in 2013, at the Bali Ministerial, WTO members agreed to work towards a permanent solution on public stockholding, basically, which means a clear legal framework that would protect programs like India's MSP program, Minimum Supports Program. The idea was simple: negotiate a permanent fix by another ministerial 4 years later. Until that permanent solution arrived, and that's extremely important, members agreed to a kind of peace clause. No one would drag a developing country to dispute settlement over subsidies tied to public stockholding of staple crops. In practice, it shields India's MSP program from legal challenges. But the problem is that the permanent solution never came. Ministerial after ministerial, the talks stalled and the mandate stayed on paper. India hasn't let this go. It has been one of the loudest voices saying this was promised, this needs to be delivered, and it shouldn't be tied to any other issue. So where does this leave things today? India is still pushing. Safeguard is still in place, but the permanent solution, the one everyone agreed to negotiate more than a decade ago, remains an unfinished business.
Dr. Aiyar, I want to go back to the point on multilateralism versus plurilateralism, which is something that Mr. Aggarwal briefly talked about and is also in your policy brief. What is this difference? What is this all about?
So it's very interesting. So, we've now talked about many areas of specific failures of the WTO, but I think running through that is this common thread of how to move ahead, where you could think about it as a philosophical divide between the multilateralists and the plurilateralists. The plurilateralists being groups of like-minded countries which want to move forward on particular issues. And on this issue, India has now planted its flag firmly on the multilateralist side. Now, I mentioned in my previous answer to you the MFN principle and the idea of a level playing field and a technocratic dispute resolution mechanism. So this, if you will, is the utopian idea of multilateralism. And since World War II, it has developed astonishing results. Hundreds of millions of people in the developing world have got access to export markets, which has hastened their escape from poverty. So undoubtedly, it is true that multilateralism is a very consequential institutional achievement, perhaps the most consequential institutional achievement of the 20th century. And India for a long time has argued that plurilateral agreements threaten this achievement. I should say that this argument has got impeccable intellectual pedigree. So Jagdish Bhagwati, who was perhaps the foremost trade economist of his generation, famously argued for many decades that bilateral and plurilateral deeds indeed threaten the multilateral architecture. They divert trade instead of creating it, they discriminate against non-members, and they undermine the spirit of multilateralism. He called it a spaghetti bowl of contradictory and often overlapping rules. So India's position at Yaoundé is faithful to that tradition. Now, in my view, the problem is that the world that Bhagwati was writing about no longer exists. I've already talked about the fact that the US is now imposing tariffs on every country in the world in ways that clearly violate the MFN principle. There's been no progress with multilateral negotiations since 2001, when the so-called Doha round was launched. Contrast this with the 20th century, where there were 8 successful rounds of multilateral negotiations, each of them yielding falls in tariffs and expansions of membership. So it's not clear that the relevant question is whether plurilateralism is better than multilateralism in some ideal world, but rather whether plurilateralism is better than nothing. So as Rajesh pointed out, India today, its digital services economy is one of the most dynamic in the world. So we should be part of whatever plurilateral agreement is going on e-commerce. We should be one of the people sitting there writing the rules. Our manufacturers are very keen to integrate in global value chains. They would be greatly served by the kind of investment facilitation agreement that India is blocking on a plurilateral basis. So rather than having this, admittedly noble defense of multilateral principles, I think that India should start engaging with plurilateralism strategically and do it in a way that plurilateralism preserves the best features of multilateralism. So I would say there are 3 things that it could ask for. First, it should insist that plurilaterals are MFN plurilaterals. That is, that they should extend to all countries the benefits of the plurilateral concessions, even to non-signatories. This would preserve the spirit of multilateralism while allowing coalitions of the willing to move forward. Now, for any economist who thinks about this for 2 seconds, there's a clear free rider problem. But the free rider problem needn't be such a problem if the participating coalition in practice is large enough and covers a sufficiently large share of global trade. And India's participation in these coalitions is often what would tip the coalition above that balance. Secondly, India should insist on open plurilaterals. These are plurilaterals that are written from the outset in such a way that a non-signatory can join in a straightforward way at any future point in time. This keeps alive the dream of multilateralism, even if at the moment it's a plurilateral initiative. And third, we should ask for plurilaterals to be housed within the WTO rather than struck outside it. If it's within the WTO, it's more transparent, there is monitoring, there is a legal framework, and the institutional pathway for expanded membership is much simpler. So by doing these 3 things, I think we can advocate for a kind of plurilateralism that even Jagdish Bhagwati would give his praise to, and that's what I think India should be doing.
Plurilateralism may be the way to preserve multilateralism, and it's probably what delivers in a might is right world that we are in.
So, Jagdish Bhagwati used to talk about plurilateralism being a stumbling block towards multilateralism, but perhaps today it's a building block towards it.
Any other takeaways, Mr. Aggarwal, from the Ministerial for India?
Look, having attended almost every ministerial, not the current one, since Doha Ministerial, Doha round of trade negotiations was launched way back in 2001, let me say that, what I can have as takeaways for India from this ministerial. See, India's traditional approach, a cautious, defensive, focused on policy space, and viewing WTO as a forum for settling the developed versus developing country trade issues made sense in the past. When our economy was small and we were not seen as of any consequence in global economy. But today, India is a $4 trillion economy, a major player in services and digital domain, actively trying to attract cutting-edge technology, foreign capital, and integrate into global value chains. In that context, a strategy based primarily on resistance, to my mind, has diminishing returns. Now, the big shift India needs to make is in how it sees the WTO itself. For years, India treated the WTO as a battleground for developed versus developing country fights. But that frame just doesn't work anymore. The real pressure on the system today comes from the US-China rivalry. And if multilateralism is going to survive that strain, India has to see itself as one of the players holding the system together. And I see 3 ingredients of this shift. 1, India has to move past the old habit of building huge global south coalitions. Developing countries aren't a single block anymore. Different growth trajectories, different interests, different levels of ambition, the frictions are real. What India needs now is issue-based strategic partnerships with the EU, with Japan, with UK, with Canada, partners who align with India on specific trade issues, not on broad ideological categories necessarily. And here's the good news. India has already built the foundation. It has recently concluded major free trade agreements with several of these players. Those FTAs aren't just market access deals, they are leverage. India should be using that leverage inside the WTO to build coalitions that actually move the needle. Because India wants to help preserve multilateralism in a world shaped by great power rivalry, it needs to work, and I emphasize, it needs to work with middle powers that share the goal issue by issue, file by file, strategy by strategy. Second, domestic alignment. Let's be honest, trade policy can't sit in its own little silo anymore. If India wants to attract manufacturing, plug itself into global supply chains, and actually compete at scale, then trade and investment can't be treated as two separate worlds. They are two sides of the same coin. And it is surprising that a country with such economic maturity still treats them like disconnected policy domains. Finally, another alignment that India needs to fix: the gap between what it agrees to in its FTAs, free trade agreements with major partners like EU, US, UK, and what it's willing to discuss at the WTO. Right now, India is sending mixed signals. It's open to certain agreements in bilateral FTAs, especially in areas like digital trade, but then it hesitates to even engage on the same issues in WTO. The foreign businesses take notice, investors take notice. It creates confusion about where India actually stands. So, if India wants to project clarity, confidence, and long term reliability, it needs to bring its domestic policies, its FTA commitments, and its WTO positions into the same frame. I mean, that consistency is what global investors look for.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you. I really do hope that the policy brief will reach the policymakers in Vanajya Bhavan, and they will probably review their position on some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Puja.